Calling, 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 calling. Call the Growth Buster. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Welcome to the Growth Busters podcast. Here we discuss our society's addiction to growth and do our best to chart a sustainable course for human civilization. On a full planet, that means it's time we stop expanding the scale of the human enterprise. We're talking about both our numbers and the size of our economy. Of course, that includes exploring ways to shrink our own individual footprints. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growth Busters, Hooked on Growth, and chief scientist here at the Institute for Advanced Growth Addiction Studies. For cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org. Well, I'm glad to say I am joined today by my two partners in growth busting, Caitlin Hickman and Ben Bacher. Welcome back. How was spring break?
It was very good.
It was really fun.
Yeah.
We both went paragliding.
Paragliding.
Yes. I think as far as sports go, it's relatively sustainable.
Yeah, it is. We use the wind or the non-wind.
That's right. That's a very low-impact recreational activity. And I can confidently report that I don't see a cast on anybody's leg or anything. So
It's true.
It is
no
true.
injuries were incurred.
No serious injuries.
Cool.
Caitlin was very bruised.
I was very bruised. It's true.
Number one on our agenda today is that there was a UN-backed biodiversity study released in March that painted a pretty bleak picture of what human expansion is doing to the planet. Now, the three of us, not really shocked or surprised, I don't think, by that news, but you know, maybe there's the hope that a few people out there might have read the limited news coverage of that and said, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Any initial thoughts about that?
The one about that Asia might run out of fish.
Yeah, that was one of the headlines, was that Asian fisheries are predicted to possibly be basically gone by 2048, I think it was.
Yeah, it's sad. I feel like I'm pretty desensitized
Yeah.
to this stuff now, though, just from working for you for such a long time and having so many conversations about this.
So
But-
sorry.
But it's definitely good, I guess, to be shocked by it as much as you can be, even if you're aware of it, to try to let it propel you into action.
Yeah, I wonder about how far along that path it'll have to be before, like, if we're talking about, like, specifically the fish one, like, before people start to actually care, you know? Like, how close do they have to get to run out of fishing before people actually start caring?
Yeah, we don't seem to be capable of like looking at the warning
No,
signs and saying,
definitely
let's not go there.
Especially before people in the West start caring.
True.
Yeah, and this is hot on the heels of the 2016 Living Planet report, which was released in 2017, that told us that from 1970 to 2012, there was a 58% overall decline in vertebrate population abundance. So for the past years or so, there's been a lot of news about how humans we really are pushing other species right off the planet.
Mm-hmm. But I think it's just hard there's just such a disconnect because, like, even though, like, you can read that, it's just like, I feel like most Americans haven't seen a significant change in living style in the past, like, 10 years, say. So it's just really hard to, even if you're reading this news, to be able to actually get that, you know?
Yeah, one of the things that get our attention is whether our wages are going up every year.
Yep, right. And I feel like there's not going to be a difference until people start seeing a, like, tangible effect in their
But even then,
standards
I
of
feel
living.
like it's going to be the lower classes first,
True.
and
Very
rich
true.
people still aren't going to care.
Right.
And yeah, resources are just going to become more and more pooled among really select people. I think it's such a social justice issue too.
But I think even eventually the richest people in their gated communities or their private islands, they will not escape. you know?
Agreed.
Eventually.
Yeah.
They'll probably
Eventually,
die
but it's
before
just
that.
going to take
Maybe.
so long, and it's frustrating that people can't make changes in their lives now when it's for the benefit of other people who are already facing effects right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess there are a few reasons for that. One, of course, is shifting baselines, the fact that it just the changes are taking place incrementally. With each passing year, we get reports on it, but it's just usually we're comparing what's happening this year to how things were a year ago, and they just changed for the worse a little bit. And then we kind of hit the reset button. And so next year we'll just compare to the year before rather than comparing to 50 years ago,
Right.
for example. We're also very short-term oriented, so we are not built to want to make a sacrifice today to make our lives better or even make sure we can survive, years into the future. We are such imperfect beings.
No, it's so true.
We really are.
What's the matter with us? So anyway, we'll put a link in the show notes to a couple of the stories about this and perhaps the study. I hadn't even had a chance to dig up the study, but basically the study was a UN study, and it was a set of reports approved by 129 governments after they had some talks in Colombia, and it was all about biodiversity. They had 4 regional reports, and I didn't even know we had an intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Wow. But as you know, they all got on airplanes and flew to Colombia for this series of meetings and wrung their hands about this, and then they went home, and how many of them had the guts to tell their government that it's time to stop worshiping economic growth and adopt a sustainable population policy and take seriously the crisis that we've created.
Right.
But it's interesting, like reading the articles, that so many of them are driven by, like, a lot of the fear about hurting the environment now seems to almost be driven by a sense of growth, which is interesting. Just like they speak in such economic terms about the value of nature. Like they say they put the value of nature at least $24.3 trillion a year, which to humans, I don't know how they come up with that.
Yeah,
But
I
it's
wasn't even going
interesting
to mention
think
that
about
because that kind of pissed me off.
Right.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting to think about that crossover and if that's a negative or positive thing of that, like, well, maybe at least now these government people are caring because the economic impact to humans is starting to become tangible. But on the other hand, it's just like a growth-oriented kind of thought.
It's the only way to get the economists interested, I guess.
Yeah.
But
and a lot of people. Not just the economists. I mean, our whole society is programmed around monetary growth and monetary value.
But Ben, I'm glad you really brought that up, the economic growth angle to this, because it's really had a huge insidious effect on our reaction to climate change. At least finally, we seem to have gotten past the debate, for the most part, about whether climate change is real and whether climate change is man-caused primarily. We seem to have gotten past that, but we still, right now, off the table is anything that's going to retard economic growth. We've got to desperately do something about this, but Katie, bar the door. Can't stop economic growth in the process. And unfortunately, economic growth just goes hand in hand with carbon emissions.
Right, definitely. Yeah, because I feel like one of the largest things is subsidies in many forms of subsidies of oil and gas, and as well as corn and meat. And I feel like cutting those subsidies would largely hurt the economy in the short term. And so they're just I feel like literally zero politicians are in favor of them, even though in the long term they'd be beneficial for the environment. Right. And the economy in the long term.
And talking about it as a social justice issue when it comes to class inequality, I feel like the idea that economic growth has the potential to lift everyone up, that myth allows people to not think about the damage that they're doing to lower class people, because the myth is that it'll help those people too. So that needs to change.
Yeah, even there's plenty of data telling us that is a myth, but myths die hard, as we know.
Yes.
And even the way nations respond to the declining birth rate, everyone should be applauding that universally as really good news, because at 7.6 billion, we have way too many people to live comfortable lives in a sustainable manner without slowly chipping away at the capacity of our life-supporting ecosystems. But governments will, they look at the economy, and if there are fewer births in their country, then that means there will be fewer workers and fewer consumers, and that means their aggregate economic growth, gross domestic product, will go down.
Right.
And so they're wringing their hands, and in a number of places they're trying to encourage people to start making more babies just because of this fake metric that really has very little to do with real quality of life, unfortunately. It's the holy grail, economic growth.
Mm-hmm. I'm definitely still at a loss for how to fix anything. And I wish that we could provide some hope, but I just don't. I don't know what to offer.
Well, one of the things I kind of hope that we're doing with this podcast is if we can slowly attract more and more people to subscribe to it and listen to it regularly, that our conversations, my hope would be, will encourage people to make changes in their own lives, which will kind of reinforce changes in their thinking, where they will, first of all, they'll stop believing in the myth that we can have perpetual growth and that growth is necessary for prosperity and well-being. But then they will start to recognize the propaganda when they see it, and it won't have its effect on them. But the more activities you do in your daily life to live simply, the more it just stays front of mind. Mm-hmm. And if it is front of mind, then you think of other ways to skinny up your lifestyle and reduce your impact. And just naturally, you will want to carpool if you have to use a car. Naturally, you'll want to walk if you could walk. Naturally, you'll want to ride your bike if you could ride.
And hopefully, eventually, you'll want to vote differently and create systemic change. But it's just such big systemic change. That's the part that daunts me.
Yeah. And, I think our only hope is that we might be creeping up on a tipping point, because the progress is too slow for us to have a lot of hope. And that's an interesting conversation I had. I host the Overpopulation podcast for the World Population Balance. And in the most recent episode, I interviewed Chris Bystroff, who's a biology professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And he's teaching a course on human population and limits to growth. The 30-year edition of the Limits to Growth book and study series is the textbook for that course. And basically, he's getting his college students to be population literate. But in the course of that, his students are learning that we are in overshoot, that we are in a crisis, and that things don't look good. And it was really fascinating to talk to him about how his students take that news. And he was talking about the stages of grief, that they went through the stages of grief. They really didn't want to believe it at first. But he also reported that they don't seem to leave the course ready to jump off the nearest bridge or skyscraper. Our only hope can be that they leave there armed with some knowledge that will really inform their voting, and maybe one of them will end up being president, since apparently anybody can.
Anybody who's a white man.
Very true.
Point taken. All right. Speaking of anybody who can be a president, our next story is really about the continued dismantling of environmental stewardship in the Trump administration. And, we have a EPA director, at least this week. We may not have him for long, but he's pretty committed to gutting our environmental safeguards and regulations. Less regulation means more profit. Mm-hmm. And that's what it's all about. So the latest news...
Depending on how you define profit, but yes.
Thanks for that reminder. So the latest news is that, first of all, a year ago, early in the Trump administration, that administration put on hold the scheduled adoption of the new version of the fuel efficiency standards for vehicles sold in the United States. The Obama administration, it's true that they kind of rushed it through at the last minute while they still had some control. So they short-circuited the process a little bit. Might as well try. But of course, as soon as the administration changed, they put on hold the adoption of those standards. And now here we are a year later, they're saying that we're definitely going to roll those back, and we're in the process of studying exactly what that's going to look like. But the current administration in the U.S. White House is committed to requiring a lot less of U.S. automakers in terms of fuel efficiency.
I was just reading that Scott Pruitt, the head of the EPA, he's kind of gotten in a scandal now because it's just found out that he's leasing a condo in Capitol Hill for $50 a night, and he's leasing it from a fossil fuels lobbyist, which explains why he got it so cheap.
Not surprised. It's so corrupt.
But here we are in a world where that's not resulting in immediate termination
in the swamp
and discipline. Very interesting, isn't it? But anyway, there's a lot of things we can talk about fuel efficiency for autos. And one of the things is that if you want to believe, let's see, Consumer Reports, I'd like to think is one of our more reliable sources out there. And they tell us that really we save more money on fuel costs for these vehicles than it costs us in higher sticker prices in order to cover the cost of these standards that require them to adopt more efficient technology, that we're really coming out ahead by requiring the more efficient technology. So that's one thing that's kind of an important point, is that it's not even penny wise and pound foolish. It seems like it's penny foolish and pound foolish.
Yeah.
Another thing, though, is the automakers have said, I think what maybe led to this is that they were clamoring for more relaxed standards or a little bit longer to meet the standards, because their standard is an average for everything that they sell. And the American consumer, largely because gas prices are so low, we are buying big SUVs and pickup trucks.
Right.
And so it's one of those cases where I'll be the first to tell you, I'll go to the cheapest gas station. I won't drive 10 miles out of my way to get cheap gas, because, God forbid, that's penny wise and pound foolish to save a couple cents on a gallon of gas, but to add to the climate change crisis that we're currently experiencing, and it's going to get worse. If there are cheap gas prices, I'm going to buy cheap gas. Right. But personally, if they put it to a vote, I'd be interested in what you think. If they put it to a vote, I would vote for higher gas prices.
Because gas is so subsidized. It's like if you travel anywhere, it's so much more expensive, like in England. And what I would worry about is that it like I can afford to pay more for gas, so I would still be able to pay for gas. But what I worry about is like people who literally can, if gas tripled, which is probably about its actual cost, probably somewhere around $9 a gallon. Then some people literally wouldn't be able to drive to work anymore. And so I worry about those effects. But
right. It's another example of how our entire system is built around this. There's no way to undo. If gas prices just became more expensive, a lot of people would seriously suffer. And again, the wealthy people would be the people who would suffer less. And that feels really, really unfair to me. So I wouldn't just want gas prices to increase. I would want gas prices to increase on a sliding scale, where maybe they were much more expensive if you made a lot more money. But
that'll happen in America.
Well,
right.
And we don't need a lot of poor people running around in pickup trucks polluting the planet either. So what about a carbon tax and having that mechanism be that gas is going to be expensive, but you get that money back?
What do you mean?
Well, you tax everybody for their high carbon acquisitions, but you give the money back to them. You write them a check, and that check would be very meaningful to a poor family. It wouldn't be very meaningful to a rich family. But a poor family, they would get enough back that they could either buy a little more gas, but ideally they could afford to use public transportation or something else. But basically it would be a little bit of an equalizer. It wouldn't be so hard on them, because if nothing else, they could buy a little more gas if that was really the only way they could get to work. And of course, we're set up, especially in places like the U.S., where we have that car culture, and unfortunately that's the case in a lot of places.
Right. I would rather incentivize cities to provide more public transportation options than incentivize people not to drive. I would rather use positive incentives in terms of better opportunities for public transportation than penalties. But I obviously think it's necessary. It's just, it becomes difficult to negotiate the ethics of when it's affecting poor people more than rich people. And another example that I can think of is farmers who use a lot of fuel. And I wouldn't want farmers to have to carry the brunt of a fuel tax. I would want that to come from, again, rich people or the federal government.
But wouldn't you want farmers to be incentivized to figure out ways that don't require so much burning of fossil fuels to
Definitely.
I would,
crops?
but I think farmers already are super incentivized to do that, because I think they know better than almost anyone else in our society, the effects of carbon emissions on their land that they are growing.
Yeah, but I also
on.
think that the tragedy of commons would play a very strong role in that, as well as even if you recognize that, it's the guy down the street, if you make your prices more expensive to use a more more fuel friendly piece of equipment, then people aren't going to buy your tomatoes. They're going to buy the cheaper tomatoes.
That's true. Yeah, so if everyone was incentivized to do it, then
right.
That's another thing that I think would take a lot of really careful planning.
For sure, definitely,
for me.
Definitely.
But I really want to circle back and visit for a moment this information that people in North America are in love with these big vehicles. I read another story recently about how the pickup truck is becoming the family car. They've got these crew cabs where they've got 4 full-size doors. The back seat of the pickup truck is big enough for your family. And unfortunately, pickup trucks there's a lot of weight there, and the fuel efficiency is pitiful. And we need more families in the overdeveloped world really committed to having smaller vehicles when they have to use a vehicle.
Well, I'm really excited for the advent of the self-driving car. I think that has the potential to really change things a lot, just because you don't necessarily need 2 cars for your family or 3 cars for your family, because you can just have one self-driving car and you can drop it off and you don't need to park it anywhere. Or there could theoretically be a pool of self-driving cars. I don't know.
True.
Probably wouldn't have that in the US, but I don't know.
I think what's interesting about this issue is that it, again, for me, super intersects with masculinity and toxic masculinity, because I could see there's a big incentive for like men to drive big trucks. I think that men are socially rewarded for that behavior more than women are. And I also could see there being a backlash from some men, more than women at least, to self-driving cars, because I think a lot of people, but men especially, feel powerful for being in control of a big vehicle. I think that's another source of...
Mm-hmm.
Well, you look at the television commercials for these big pickup
terrible
trucks. I don't think you guys don't watch a lot of TV, but apparently enough that you've seen those.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is all about the size of your truck is directly related to the size of your cojones.
Yeah, that is how it's advertised.
But I think there's the potential that like the financial incentive for self-driving cars could be so huge that I don't know that like it would overcome that.
Well, I hope that self-driving cars will take us to a place where there are fewer vehicle trips. I'm not sure how that's going to physically work out, but you've got a good point that we could end up with fewer vehicles,
but the same number of trips.
But I would hope that that somehow we would find we would do a whole lot more car sharing, and there just wouldn't be so many round trips of vehicles.
Right.
Because if there was technology that we could implement with the cars to make that whole system the most fuel efficient that it could be, and there were a lot of pickups, that would be really cool.
Yeah, because what happens if we have self-driving cars and you're in San Francisco where you can't park? I don't know if you've ever tried to park in the middle of San Francisco. It's insane.
Very difficult.
Yeah. So you have a self-driving car. You say, drop me off at my meeting here, and then tell your car, drive around the block until I come back out. Well, we haven't gained anything if those self-driving cars are circling the block.
I think there's the potential for very few people to, I mean, who knows how far in the future this is, but for very few people to actually need to own cars, because say you're driving, then it wouldn't be your car. It'd essentially be a taxi owned by the government.
Right.
Then maybe you pay a nominal fee or it's paid by taxes, and then it drops you off and goes and picks someone else up.
Yeah, that would make more sense. It's like kind of going to the airport. Right now, if you take your significant other to the airport and drop them off to make a trip, and then you drive back home, that's a round trip.
Right.
If they took Uber or a cab, that's a one-way trip, because then that Uber or cab is going to wait at the airport and pick somebody up. And so hopefully self-driving cars will enable more of that to happen. Yeah. But anyway, according to Consumer Reports, if we didn't roll back the standards, by 2025, you would save about $3,200 in gas costs, $4,800 in gas costs for your truck or SUV over the life of the vehicle. But the added cost of the vehicle wouldn't be that much. And, of course, the automakers, we all know that they need a little bit of a nudge, some kind of incentive to keep pushing the technology. Although I did note that after it came out that the EPA was going to probably suggest rolling these back, Ford issued a statement saying, we really don't favor that. Yeah, so that's interesting. And here's the really exciting fresh news, and that is... Okay, so here's the story from EcoWatch. 50-plus mayors vow to vigorously resist EPA's fuel efficiency rollback.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's the flavor of the 4 years. It seems to be that just because we have a White House that's stuck in the Stone Age doesn't mean that the rest of us are going to blindly follow. Right. So we've got attorneys general and mayors from more than 25 states that have banded together and signed this document committing to sticking with that if there's any way possible that they can do that. Scott Pruitt as of this record date, is still head of the EPA. Who knows by the time by the time this is published, he may be out already. But I find it interesting how he defended the rollback. He said that it's another step in President Donald Trump's deregulatory agenda. No surprise there. This president has shown tremendous courage to say to the American people that America is going to be first. And I think this midterm evaluation, the auto sector, the importance of auto manufacturing in this country, the president is again saying America is going to be put first, and we have nothing to be apologetic about with respect to the progress we've made in reducing emissions as a country. Now, I'm sorry I repeated that because I just gave, a few more ears to the lie. But,
well, it does seem very, just hearing that, it sounds like very politically motivated as well. I mean, because I feel like with the midterms coming up, maybe they're probably trying to swing a couple points in the auto manufacturing belt, which is pretty big section. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that.
Yeah.
Probably so.
It's just weird that it's coming from the EPA. It's just so ironic, among a number of things that feels very backwards right now.
I think I got distracted, and I was talking about the fact that I would vote to pay higher prices for gas. But it seems to me like it's kind of weird that I will buy the cheaper gas, but I would gladly vote for more expensive gas.
Right.
I don't think that's weird. I think that's very tragedy of the commons-esque, because you're working in the system that you have the biggest economic incentive to buy the cheapest gas. And, it's not making things better if you buy the more expensive gas, And so I think if everyone was mutually incentivized to pay more for gas, then I think that's a very reasonable economic solution.
Right.
Do you think most of us would do that?
Would vote to, but no.
No.
Why not?
Definitely
Why
not.
not? Why not? What's wrong with us?
Well, I think some people can't afford to. And some people can marginally afford to, but just don't want to.
And I think that the people who could afford to still most of the time would vote not to.
True, yeah.
I don't think you're crazy for buying cheaper gas. I think there are other issues that make me think of what the phenomenon that you were just talking about. I know people who would vote to have a limitation on how much meat someone can eat in a week, but they still eat meat pretty regularly. That's an interesting one for me.
Yeah. I probably count myself in that group.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that one that feels different because I don't think buying more expensive gas would do anything to solve the problem.
I agree.
But I
That is
think
different.
eating less meat would do something.
Well, it's not the buying of more expensive gas, it's buying less.
Less gas, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
Less
That's a good way
gas.
to put it.
Yeah. That's what we've got to do
But I feel like you already try to buy as little gas as you can, so I don't think it would make that much of a difference.
Yeah, not on people like me. I'm already
Right.
kind of, well along on that journey. But I think over the long haul, it seems like money talks. And
Right.
we're going to have to
Definitely.
figure out ways
Definitely.
to take advantage of that to influence public behavior in the right direction. All right. Well, are we at that time of the show every episode where we get to talk about lightening the load?
I think we are
Yeah.
indeed. Do you want to go first? You're so excited about yours before the show.
I probably never go first, so okay. What the heck. I was on a trip a week and a half ago, and we visited a relative's house. And I am a pretty firm coffee drinker. I don't drink a lot, but I like to have a cup or two in the morning, especially since there's not much else to do at 4 a.m. when I frequently get up.
Oh my God.
Well, the coffee maker at this family's house it was one of those Keurig coffee makers with the little K-cups. One cup of coffee at a time. But the coffee, comes in these little plastic disposable cups, and that just really chaps my hide. That just seems like such an unnecessary.
Yeah.
Really? Do we really have to have one more silly reason to be making plastic and filling up landfills with these little cups of plastic because we're just too friggin' lazy to make a cup of coffee the old-fashioned way? And I thought about that, and I thought, actually, I probably have a more environmentally friendly way of making coffee than most people because, as you know, I've got a little espresso maker upstairs, so I don't use any paper filters even. I'm not doing drip coffee. So there's nothing disposable really in the process of
Right.
the coffee I'm making. But it really bugs me about those little K-Cups, and I just happened across a story about that recently, which had some pretty good news. And actually, I'm going to include a link to this in the show notes because I think a lot of people might want to look at this. And what it is it's the ultimate guide to recycling K-Cups, Nespresso capsules, and other coffee pods. It says, with a little effort, you can make your coffee habit greener. And so this little series of web pages actually has some really good information to help you if you just have to be or you're stuck with, these single serving coffee makers, how to make the best of it. Oh, and you know what? I got to give due credit. This was Consumer Reports, and you do not have to have a membership to access this story. So look for the link in the show notes. But one of their suggestions was, well, if you really don't want to make a whole coffee pot at a time, you really like the single serving variety, there are some single serving drip coffee makers that do not require those cups, and there are some refillable, reusable cups that you can use. But the good news is that Keurig makes a few of their products actually are recyclable.
Interesting.
Cups, yeah.
And compostable. My family had a Keurig or has a Keurig, and we always buy compostable Keurig cups. And there are also ones that you can refill with your own coffee beans, and they don't need a filter either.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and this might seem kind of silly, but Keurig has 29% of the market for coffee makers, apparently. So that's big. And so it's good news is that they are working on making all of their pods recyclable. Apparently, currently you can recycle their K-Mug, their K-Carafe, and their View pods. And pods for Green Mountain Breakfast Blend and Green Mountain Breakfast Blend Decaf. I don't know why only those blends would, it seems like if they've got the technology figured out, they could put all their blends in
that's
that.
Weird.
But their goal is for all K-Cups to be recyclable by 2020. So that's great. Now, interestingly, Nespresso coffee pods are made of aluminum. So they're easily recyclable.
Interesting.
Yeah. Another thing interesting I learned was that even if you're dealing with the K-Cups, that many of them actually are recyclable. They're just a pain in the rear to do that. First of all, the advice in the column is if the number, they have how all plastics have the number on them to tell you what kind of plastic it is. And the number 7, apparently very few cities can recycle 7 plastics, but many of these are 5, and most cities recycling facilities can handle the 5. But you've got to get rid of the filter and the foil cap off of it.
Well, and I feel like most people who buy a K-Cup in the first place aren't the people who are going to go to...
They're looking for convenience. Yeah, but if you're buying, better than recycling even, because recycling takes so much energy, is buy the biodegradable ones. Those are really, you can just throw them away or compost them, and that's super easy, requires just the same amount of effort as throwing away the non-recyclable ones.
Right.
Yeah.
Or you could also never buy a K-Cup in the first place.
Yeah, that would be the best thing. But I'm really glad you brought that up, Caitlin, because it is. We've kind of developed this culture where we sort of assuage our guilt by, if it's recyclable, we don't worry about it. And the fact is, recycling materials...
It takes so much energy.
Right.
We really should consume less in the first place.
Well, and also I might have brought it up before, I read this really good thing that coined the term wish cycling. And it's like recycling something like to feel good, even though it's like actually like if you recycle something but you don't actually clean it out or you don't check the number to make sure, and then it's actually worse than throwing it in the trash because
it uses more energy.
Right, and they have to like pick through the load and pick out so it gets more expensive. And
I like that term, wish cycling.
It's a really good term.
That should,
But I mean, I've been guilty of it before.
Me too.
We could have some fun with that. But I thought about that, trying to imagine how much time it would take to actually render a K-Cup, ready to put in the recycle bin. And I read that it's challenging to get all of the little aluminum foil stuff off of it. And I think a lot of people may not realize that, if you have an item made of 2 recyclable materials, say part of it's aluminum and part of it's plastic, and you don't separate them, chances are that they're going to get just tossed when they the recycling
people don't
machine,
want to hear that.
Yeah, that's too much labor for them to do. And it is too much labor because you're probably going to stand in your kitchen for 5 minutes getting this stupid little K-Cup ready.
I vote by the biodegradable ones.
Okay.
I vote by a non-K-Cup coffee machine.
But then you still have the paper filters to throw away.
Yeah, but those are compostable. I think almost all of them are compostable.
I guess that's true. Yeah.
And there are coffee machines that don't require the paper filters.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that have just a screen.
But and you can buy a Keurig though that is every cup that you make it's reusable.
I'm just I just think the K-Cup is just kind of a silly idea that has a great marketing team. Like, it's crazy that they have 30% of the market, and the machine itself is way more expensive than a simple coffee machine you get, and then you pay a ton for the pods, you know? It's like you could spend $1,000 on coffee in a year. Like, I might as well just go to Starbucks and get a cup, you know?
Yeah, it is such a sign. I mean, anthropologists will get a chuckle over this in the future if there are any. Yeah, because it is just so silly.
I know. I love to think about like alien geologists, like who come back and look at Earth and will be so confused. They'll be so confused.
In favor of the Keurig, it takes like 20 seconds to make a cup of coffee, and if you just buy the one that you fill with your own coffee grinds every time, then you're not buying the cups ever. So it is the one time, maybe the purchase is more expensive once, but I'm just saying I don't think that all people who buy Keurigs are stupid or ridiculous.
I'm not saying they're stupid. I'm not saying they're stupid.
Love you, Mom and Dad.
Insulting your parents.
Let the record show that we love Caitlin's mom and dad.
No, I respect the purchase. I just think they have a great marketing team. They really do.
That's true. I'm so glad that they came up with a reusable one. But let me finally say that 4th on the list or 10th on the list is, stand there in the kitchen for 5 minutes and go through that process, and you'll feel better that you did it. And I'm saying that because I'm one of those crazy people. I mean, I will go out of my way and spend extra time separating 2 different materials from a recyclable
I bet that
product.
does feel good when you're done. You've done a good deed.
Yeah, and I hope that's for the good, because it could just be overdevelopment, guilt, some kind of fake guilt,
Then you can
having
go
a hard
buy
time
a
coming up with the word.
Cadillac.
Yeah, it's like buying carbon credits. It's just it
Right,
lets you off the hook for having a lousy habit to begin with.
Right.
Yeah, but I feel like as long as it doesn't make you feel like you're some kind of like eco god, and you still do all the other things you would do, it's good, I think.
Am I an eco god?
No.
Rats. That was starting to sound pretty good.
Pretty
but
hard
you
as an
really,
American.
you really smiled when you considered the thought.
Okay, so I know I took way too long on my lightening the load, but who can top that one?
I can go next. Mine is relatively simple, but it's just something that my sister told me a long time ago, is that when you're driving, I know sometimes I've thought when I go on the highway or if I'm driving fast, I keep the windows down instead of putting AC on if it's a hot day, because I always thought that was more efficient. You feel like AC is terrible. But actually, anytime you're going over 30 miles per hour, it's more efficient to actually have the AC on, because it increases drag so much that it does terrible things to your fuel efficiency.
Lowering the windows does.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's better to have the AC on when you're going above 30 miles per hour.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That is good to know.
That is good to know. That makes me happy, because I always felt bad for having the AC or the heat on.
You probably think you're an eco god now.
Yeah.
Goddess.
Yeah.
Well, what is the eco goddess doing these days to lighten the load?
I'm composting.
Yahoo.
I can't take much credit for it because my housemate does all of the work, but he has there's one really big compost bin in our house that's filled with worms, and one that's really small that we have right by our kitchen sink. And now every time I contribute food waste to the system, I'm at least composting it, and that makes me feel a little bit better. And all the bins are totally smell proof, which I know is something that my parents were afraid of when I proposed getting a compost bin at our house a long time ago. And it seems like it's not that much maintenance either, but it's a much better feeling than throwing away, especially because I'm already guilty anytime I throw away food that I didn't eat, both because I bought it and because I know I'm contributing to a not great system.
Well, it's great at our school. And I think most cities in the U.S. now have like an option, like our house pays $5 a week and someone comes by in a bike and picks up our compost. And I think a lot of cities have that option, which is really cool, because it's kind of hard to compost in a city. So yeah, I think that's a really cool option as well.
Yeah.
So where does your compost go from your house, Caitlin?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer. I'm guessing that when our bins get full, he drops it off at Colorado College. But I'm not sure, because I feel like he makes real, actual compost. Like, it's not just food remnants. It becomes useful. I know he wants to start a garden, so maybe that'll happen in the spring.
Yeah, if you guys had a garden, then obviously it could just go right there. But I was
Right.
kind of curious about that and surprised to hear that you have a service, because my wife and I, we live on a pretty steep hillside, and it's pretty challenging to do a garden, and we also have a serious time famine over here. No excuse, but that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. So, but I would like to compost and not waste that. And I've been wishing for a way to donate my compost to somebody who could make good use of it. And I'm guessing even if there isn't a service that will pick it up, that it wouldn't be that hard for you to find somebody.
You should
Right.
definitely
With an urban garden.
just start a trash bin in your outside, and then have a Tupperware, and every time your trash bin gets full every couple months, you could totally just bring it down to the CC farm. You should definitely do like they would love to have it.
True.
There you
Sure,
go.
there's a spot you can just dump
But
it.
another cool idea for people who aren't near Colorado College would be, I feel like neighbors or neighborhoods could do compost shares. I bet in most neighborhoods there are at least a few people who garden, and if you just found them and there were some, like if there was a compost bin between every few houses, if you could find someone in your neighborhood who composted, that would be kind of a cool idea.
Yep.
My dad's gotten really into compost. It's really cute. He like goes out and checks the thermometer like every night, and like it's getting really hot. It's like 130 degrees.
It's
You
exciting.
actually have to be careful that it doesn't ignite. 'Cause there have been
Wow.
some fires because of that. Yeah.
Wild.
Can you put coffee grounds in with other compost, or do you have to keep them separate for other composting
I think you can
types
put them
of
in.
uses?
I'm pretty sure. I think they're actually very good for compost.
All
Yeah,
right.
there have been things that I've been very skeptical of composting, and every time I find out that it's okay. So
That's good, because I know sometimes you're tempted to just eat half of a Hostess Twinkie, and what do you do with the other half?
I've just started putting everything in the compost. Like I put some like nails in the compost. I call it wish posting.
I don't.
That's going to take a
I
long
don't
time.
think that's how that works.
Everything's biodegradable eventually. I'm composting for the sake of the aliens who will come to inhabit Earth when we're dead from climate
It's
change.
good.
Yes.
We'll
In
put,
case any
appreciate it.
listeners don't know, he's being sarcastic.
so you should put like a Keurig coffee machine in the compost for those
Put a
anthropologists to
Keurig
find.
in
That
the
would be.
compost.
I'll go around and break into people's houses and steal their K-Cut, like their Keurigs, and compost them. That'll be great.
It sounds like a really do you feel like a bio god?
I do. Yes.
Starting to sound like an eco-terrorist.
I just think that would be such
Breaking
a
into
funny like
houses and-
string of
yeah.
thieves, of like thefts. You know.
Yeah,
Now I'm
look
probably
out.
on a list somewhere.
Greenpeace is probably going to start doing that.
I gave them some ideas.
Yeah. Not just going after whaling vessels,
Some in the NSA.
going after K-Cups too. Well, don't forget to explore issues at growthbusters.org, subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app, and give us a review if you like what we're doing. And if you haven't seen the documentary Growthbusters, Hooked on Growth, it's easy enough to find at growthbustersmovie.org or on Amazon.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.